Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of History with Mrs. Lee. Today I want to cover topics that could show up on our fall semester final exam. So we're going to go ahead and go all the way back to the 13 colonies. We had 3 colonial regions: New England, established by the Pilgrims and Puritans for religious freedom; the Middle Colonies, with a major group being the Quakers. And the middle colonies were often referred to as the breadbasket because they grew the most grain for the colonies. And then we had the southern colonies that were mostly established for economic reasons. A lot of these southern colonies grew cash crops, which is ultimately the cause of the transatlantic slave trade. Now, there were some documents and institutions that came out of these 13 colonies, but also from England, where these colonists originally came from. And these documents and people and institutions would lead to the creation of our Constitution in 1787. So we're going to start with the Magna Carta in 1215, and this is the first time that we see a limited government. We had the House of Burgesses, which was part of the Virginia colony in 1619, and this was the first representative government, which allowed the people to have a voice. We had the Mayflower Compact in 1620 from the New England colonies, and the Mayflower Compact is significant because it was the first self-government. We had the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, established by Thomas Hooker. And the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut were important because they were a form of representative government, but also increased the amount of people who were allowed to vote. We had the English Bill of Rights, which helped inspire our American Bill of Rights, which we'll talk about in a little bit. We had John Locke. He was an Enlightenment thinker, and he supported unalienable rights that we will see used in the Declaration of Independence. And he also encouraged people to overthrow their government. Get rid of it, replace it with a new one if your government does not support your rights. We also studied the Frenchman Charles de Montesquieu. He was a big believer in the 3 branches, and that's going to lead to separation of powers in our Constitution. And we also talked about 2 time periods, one called the Great Awakening, which was mostly about religious freedom, equality, and we talked about enlightenment, becoming informed about issues, but both of these in common encourage people to use their voice in government, and we could say that all of these things in this list contributed to the growth of representative government in America. Now, let's talk about some of the grievances that colonists experienced in the 1700s. The first one was mercantilism. And mercantilism was when England would not allow us to trade with others. We could only trade with the mother country. And mercantilism only benefits the mother country. She gets rich off of our items that we were trying to sell. We also had the grievance of no taxation without representation, which we will talk about after the French and Indian War here in just a minute. We also said that the king acted like a tyrant, and we were also upset because the king and parliament eventually suspended our American legislatures from meeting during the revolutionary time period. Okay, now in order to get to that revolutionary time period, let's back up just a little bit, and we're going to talk about the French and Indian War. Remember, this is a war fought over land west of the Appalachian Mountains against France and the Native Americans. We win the war, however, England goes into debt, and because England is now in debt, they are going to increase taxes and make the colonists help pay off the debt. The king will also pass a law called the Proclamation Act of 1763, and this said that colonists could not move west of the Appalachian Mountains. Both the Proclamation Act and taxation without representation would be considered grievances that we had with England. During this revolutionary time period, we had some significant people like Thomas Paine and Mercy Otis Warren. They were writers who wrote to influence Americans to become patriots and support independence from England. We had Sam Adams. He was the leader of the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty threw the Boston Tea Party to protest taxes, and the Boston Tea Party led to the intolerable acts passed by the Parliament that punished the colonists for the Boston Tea Party. We also studied our French ally, Marquis de Lafayette. We studied John Paul Jones, the father of the American Navy, and we also studied Crispus Attucks, who was the first person killed in the Boston Massacre, which was then used as propaganda to convince more Americans to become patriots. Okay, we also studied the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson on July 4th, 1776, and this was ultimately telling England that we would not support their treatment of us anymore. We wanted our independence. We felt that our government should protect the unalienable rights of people, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And unalienable rights, we feel, are rights that should be protected by the government, but also rights that all humans are born with, regardless of whether you're from America or not. Now, they could possibly ask us questions about the chronology of the American Revolution. And so remember, we go LSVY stop. So the first battles are the battles of Lexington and Concord, also known as the shot heard round the world. We have the Battle of Saratoga, which is referred to as the turning point of the Revolution. And we start winning the war, and France becomes our ally and supports our independence. We have the winter camp at Valley Forge, where George Washington and his troops were low on supplies, but they were able to move on forward and able to prove that they were willing to fight for our country. And then we have Yorktown, the final battle of the American Revolution, where England decides to surrender to the Americans. Now, we get our official independence when we sign the Treaty of Paris, and this will also give us land west to the Mississippi River. That will be our new boundary. All right, now during this time period, though, we had started setting up our first national government, also known as the Articles of Confederation, and we use the hand to remember the major weaknesses of this first government. The most important weakness to remember is that the AOC created a weak federal government because we were scared of our country turning into a tyranny, as we had experienced with England. A major strength of the AOC, though, was the Northwest Ordinance, and this was an orderly process for territories to become states in our Union. Now, the event of Shay's rebellion with the angry farmers, this is going to lead us to realize that the Articles of Confederation were too weak and we needed a stronger federal government. So we go to the Constitutional Convention in 1787 in Philadelphia. The first issue that we discuss at the convention is the idea of representation. We have New Jersey representing small-sized states, and they want to have equal representation in Congress. We had Virginia representing large-sized states, and they want population to determine our representation in Congress. Well, since we can't get anybody to vote for one over the other, we end up with the Great Compromise. And the Great Compromise says our Congress will be a bicameral legislature. It will have two houses. One will be the Senate, which will be based on equal representation, and one will be the House of Representatives based on population. The other major issue at the convention was the idea of slavery. They decide not to ban slavery, but we want to know how we're going to deal with taxation and representation. So the 3/5 compromise says that 3 out of 5 slaves will count for a state's taxation purposes and also for its representation purposes. Now, we can't just have a few guys write this Constitution and approve it for the entire country, so we need to go through the ratification process. The Federalists are going to be headed up by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. They want to ratify the Constitution as it was written, and they want a strong federal government. But their foes are the Anti-Federalists, and they are led by George Mason. They do not want to ratify the Constitution unless a Bill of Rights is added, and they would have preferred a weak federal government. Okay? So ultimately, we do add a Bill of Rights, which we will talk about in just a moment. But first, I want to discuss the 7 principles or major ideas of the Constitution. And we remember the 7 principles as flip rocks. You will be asked all the time about the principle of federalism. And remember that this is the idea that the national government shares power with the states. And then they also have some powers in the middle that are shared concurrent powers, like the power to tax. So the federal government has the power to declare war, but states have the power to make decisions about licenses. We have the idea of limited government based on the Magna Carta, that even the rulers of our country will have to follow the same laws as everyone else. Individual rights is best shown in our Bill of Rights. The government is to protect the people's rights. Popular sovereignty, we the people are in charge of our country. Republicanism, people vote for representatives to be their voice. Checks and balances, no branch can become more powerful than the other, so we can check each other from becoming too strong. And separation of powers, going back to Charles de Montesquieu's idea that we should have 3 branches of government. So the legislative is in charge of making laws, the executive is in charge of enforcing the laws, and the judicial branch is in charge of judging or interpreting the laws. Now, some ways that checks and balances could play out here is legislative can impeach the president, they can override his vetoes, they can also have the power to declare war and collect taxes. Executive branch has the power to veto. They can make treaties as long as the legislative branch approves. And then the judicial branch has the power of judicial review. They can decide if laws passed by the legislative branch and enforced by the president are unconstitutional. Okay. Now, moving on to our Bill of Rights, we have our video with all the hand signals to remember. But number 1, 2, 3, and 4 are significant because they all represent grievances that we had with England and wanted to address in our Constitution. So number 1, religion, assembly, petition, press, and speech. 2, the right to bear arms. 3, no quartering soldiers. And 4, no search and seizure without a warrant. Okay, 5, 6, 7, and 8 are all similar because they are the rights of the accused. So the Fifth Amendment is due process. The government has to protect accused people's rights and give them a process to prove their innocence or guilt, and they also have the right to remain silent. The Sixth Amendment, you have the right to a trial by jury for criminal cases, and you also have the right to have a lawyer represent you. Seventh Amendment, you also have the right to have a trial by jury for civil cases over $20. Number 8, no cruel and unusual punishments, no excessive fines or fees. The Ninth Amendment is called rights not enumerated. Basically, just because a right is not listed doesn't mean you don't have it. And finally, number 10 is the idea of federalism, going back to the 7 principles. The federal government shares power with the states. Any powers not taken by the federal government can be snatched up by the states. Finally, we talked about the process of citizenship and citizens' responsibilities. To become a citizen, you have to be at least 18 or older, live in the country for 5 or more years, speak English, take a civics test, and pass an interview, and then take an oath of allegiance to our country and Constitution. Now, that is if you are becoming a naturalized citizen. If you were born in America, or you have at least one parent who is an American citizen, then you already have your citizenship. Finally, responsibilities of citizens. We expect citizens to serve on a jury if called, and the reason we do this is because we want to have citizens listen to the accused story to decide if they're innocent or guilty instead of just one person, one judge, being in charge of your fate. We expect citizens to vote in elections, exercise the principle of republicanism. We expect citizens to pay their taxes, follow the laws, and to be informed of issues in our country. All right, go ahead and study up your Quizlet, your study guide, review any of my old YouTube videos. Remember to cap your questions and try your very best tomorrow.